you take it today?
Well, thanks.
I'll gift it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Online with OnPoint episode 12.
Ooh, you got it.
I did.
I was worried you weren't going to get it, but you got it.
Surprise.
Good evening, everybody. This is episode 12 Online with OnPoint. So excited that you're, again, joining us. We are in week 4 of this series that we've been in and called Atypical, where we've been talking about these not-so-typical families with the reality that none of us belong to a typical family and anymore. I don't know if there is such a thing as a typical family. But, man, families are beautiful. And families are just something that we're so passionate about, as hopefully you guys have seen through the conversations that have come out of the last few weeks. But man, we love family. We believe in the power of family. We know that family is messy at times and requires grace and requires some unconditional love. But man, I think as the weeks have progressed leading up to this week, this may be the most challenging of all our conversations. And so the first week we started, and we've been in Genesis this entire time. So we started talking through Adam and Eve and this idea that God uses these not so typical families, that man, none of us belong to a typical family, and that's okay because God uses these not so typical families to do just amazing things to spread his love and peace throughout all of human history. And so just something that we've been reading through Genesis, and then from there we moved to further our story, and we actually talked about the power of prayer. And then last week we went week 3 with the story of Jacob and Esau, where we talked a little bit through how God uses tough conversations to really further our intimacy with him and our understanding with him, but also I think when we're effectively able to lead through tough conversations, I think we see some fruit from when we're able to do that. And then which leads us into week 4, we're actually going to be talking about Jacob's son Joseph this week and the story of him and his brothers, but actually talking today of the power of forgiveness. But just before we really dive too much into the story, what about forgiveness do you think makes it so difficult? And if you want to speak on what makes it so difficult to understand, or what makes it so difficult to actually express to other people, like to actually forgive people, what makes that so difficult to understand, or like maybe what are some questions or things that you thought maybe growing up in high school, middle school, of just some questions you may have had when people would tell you, hey, you need to forgive so-and-so. Well, sometimes we don't know how to do that. Sometimes we don't fully grasp it. Sometimes we must understand it. But what was the challenges for you growing up and how you saw forgiveness?
I think a lot of when it comes to forgiveness, it's hard and it's really uncomfortable. And it diminishes the pride that you may have within a situation. So especially when we're younger, I feel like we aren't able to control a lot within our lives. Living at home, living with families who are not typical. Forgiveness is one of the things that we could control, especially when you're younger. So it's easier to hold those grudges because you're like, well, this is the one thing I can control and manage. And I think that the thing with forgiveness that I've learned is the how intimate it is for yourself, and the relationship you have with God and how you approach it, because of when you think about forgiveness, you're always really focused on the other person. You're like, the first thing that comes to mind is like, oh, I have to do this for this person, or I have to say it's okay, or whatever that looks like. But at the end of the day, it turns back into you making that choice and the reasons why you're stepping to that forgiveness for that relationship. And I think when you're younger, it's really hard to grasp that, because you're so like, oh, putting the blame on someone else, because it's easier to push your emotions and those thoughts onto other people rather than dealing with it yourself. Yeah.
I think the word you said there was emotion too. So I know for me, when I was a teenager and when I was younger, I drove so many of my actions and interactions off emotion, right? So like, man, all of my memories are based. I mean, you form memories around emotion, right? So whether they're good memories or bad memories, it's your best emotions and your worst emotions. Those are the things that you remember. And so I just feel like emotions and feeling are oftentimes the things that of why I had so much difficulty leading into forgiveness when I was younger, just because and I've heard many of our students that and the reality is, and why this conversation is so hard is some of you and some of our families have experienced some things that in the natural human thinking of things, of whether it's through the lens of karma, you get what you deserve and that kind of stuff, or whatever, is it just doesn't seem logical to forgive someone who has really, really wronged you. I think it's one thing to forgive somebody who maybe lied to you a little bit, or stepped on your toe, but there are some real circumstances that we encounter within our relationships that, and I've heard many people say this, this is the phrase I always hear: I will never be able to forgive blah 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 for what they did to me, and that's a reality. That is a reality that I think that makes this conversation so difficult, because there is some real raw emotion, there's some scarring, some bruising there, just mentally and emotionally, and the forgiveness process can be extremely draining. And so, I think it was just, for me, it was just so much easier to hold on to the grudge or the anger or the bitterness towards whoever had wronged me, because, man, forgiveness meant that I was going to have to deal and flesh out my emotion. And that was something that was extremely hard for me. It's still difficult for me to do, but, I do think as you get older and you mature, and especially as Christians, those of us who've made the decision to follow Jesus, as we mature and as we get older, our hope and desire is that as we study and as we live and as we, get to know more people, like, we will continue to grow in this transformation process of becoming more and more like Jesus. And Jesus was the one who ultimately, is the ultimate forgiver of all things, right? Because he died on a cross for our sins, a debt that we were meant to pay, and he paid that for all of us. So we get to encounter and really experience the full nature of what forgiveness means for us by following this Jesus that we have. So anyways, all right, so that's what I wanted to lead with, just to kind of get our brain thinking of like, man, this is some deep stuff. But do you want to just kind of recap some of the Joseph story? Or do you want me to recap it?
No,
or?
I can recap it.
Okay.
So we know that Joseph was obviously, like, his brothers would consider him the favorite of Jacob, and so through that jealousy and through that anger and through all those emotions, they decide to sell Joseph as a slave, and lie to his father and say that Jacob was killed by an animal, and they bring his coat and say, like, here's his remains, what was left, and it was, Jacob's favorite coat, and so that leads Joseph to into the kingdom, where he becomes a slave, but then he also becomes imprisoned through that process, and the king starts having these dreams, and nobody knows what they mean or what the story behind the dreams are, and then Joseph says, I can interpret those dreams, I can tell you what's going to happen, and that kind of leads to him saving the kingdom and saving thousands and of lives within that kingdom. And so because of what he did, he is boosted into royalty, and working in the kingdom with the right hand of the king, for saving the people. And his brothers decide to reach out. They decide to
they kind of stumble upon the reality that as they go, because there's a great famine right in the land, and so they had to go to the kingdom because Joseph had interpreted this dream that, hey, there's going to be a famine to come, and so we need to prepare. And so they entered a preparation season that would lead into a season of famine, and they were the kingdom who was prepared for that, which I think is just a great illustration of our lives, right? Because we all go through seasons of famine, but here, that's another story for another day, but just so many powerful things that happen in this story. But yeah, I mean, so his brothers stumble upon the reality that, oh, Joseph is kind of the brain behind this. And so
he's the reason that we can go and get food and not be stuck in this situation. And I think that within that story, like, I mean, I remember like going to like Sunday school and hearing the very like kid-friendly version of like, and everyone was happy, like kind of like a Disney ending, like everyone's happy and they hugged and they lived happily ever after, and they all loved each other and they said they were sorry, they apologized. But I think like the weight, like as you mature and as you grow up and you reflect on these stories that you were probably told so often growing up, but when you reflect on these intense stories and you kind of like try to put yourself in that person's shoes is where it gets really, really hard. Like to think that I had family members that sold me into slavery, and so how God uses this story, I think, is a great, a great way of seeing what forgiveness is.
It's a great story of redemption, but even then, like, not only how Joseph is redeemed from being a slave into royalty, and there's some great imagery there, but the reality of the story with his brothers. I mean, and the crazy thing within some of this too that we lose sight of is the culture of the kingdom, right? So in that day and age, this is why the brothers, in encountering Joseph, and actually like realizing once it comes to the reality of like, oh, this is him, and then we're gonna kind of capture some of this in chapter 50 in a second of one of their final interactions before the book of Exodus takes over, but there's the reality of that kingdom is that with Joseph's position, he could literally, at the drop of a hat, appoint and have reason for people to be killed, right? Like when you're the head of a kingdom, and you're sitting next to the king and getting a voice into the decision-making process, man, the king has the authority to dictate the laws, to dictate, it wasn't like a voting process that we have now, like within some of the democracy that we have. It was much more of like a dictatorship. So what the king said went. And so when there's some of this happening, you can imagine, okay, a group of brothers sell their other brother into slavery. Years later, they come across him, and he's sitting now in a seat of royalty. Like you would have to think, well, this is it. Like, I mean, at the snap of a finger, like he could end my life. Which I think, again, the reality of knowing Joseph's position only furthers our understanding of how powerful forgiveness is in this story. Because, I mean, he has the authority to, and that's even really when we make it to Genesis 50, which is the last chapter of Genesis. There's an interaction where actually Jacob dies, which is the father, right? And so they've even had an interaction, Joseph and the brothers, and they've kind of like made up. But even then, there's this second thing that happens with Jacob passing. All the brothers kind of feel this guilt overwhelm them of saying, man, what if he holds a grudge through the lens that we stripped his entire relationship away from his father, right? Like, because when he was sold into slavery, his dad thought he was dead and probably had already come to grips and to terms with the reality that, okay, well, one of my sons has died. And so Joseph had missed out on a relationship with his father and with his family for years. And so even though that they'd already started this process of healing, a tragedy happens, Jacob dies, and then all of a sudden this rush of emotion of like, what's going to happen? And so this is where this powerful interaction happens, because the brothers are scared, and so they actually send word to Joseph in this interaction that where they basically hire somebody to lie for them and say, hey, Jacob on his deathbed said, you need to forgive your brothers. And part of that, there was kind of this agreement that, but they're going to be your servants, right? They've indebted you. They are dedicating the rest of their lives for servitude for you. And then this is where this beautiful interaction is after this encounter. In verse 19 of Genesis 50, it says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.'" I think that's just such a powerful statement there, because for many reasons. But the reality is we never fully see God's plan as things happen in our life. And so when we get to chapter 37 of Genesis and we see what the brothers have done, we don't get to see what God is going to do with that story. What we see is this has been a horrific tragedy of brothers being led by their emotion of hatred and anger, of selling their brother into slavery. But God was able to redeem that and then had a plan for what Joseph's position was, and had gifted him, right? Even enslaved, even in prison, God had granted a gift to Joseph to be able to interpret these dreams, and it ended up saving, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people through this famine.
And I think to just to go off of how you say how God redeemed that, and I'm like, we are all probably in a point in our life where we're so stuck in our emotions that we're not looking past what's happening, and we're not looking past the struggle that we're experiencing right now because of someone else, or because of something that they did to us to hurt us. But knowing that God can take any story, especially one as crazy as this, and redeem it, that's the hope within that.
Yeah.
And the importance of that forgiveness,
Yeah. And while we're having this series and having this conversation about, man, we have all been a part of families who have wronged us and have let us down, and some stories may be a little more drastic than others, but yeah, God really does have the ability to redeem stories. And in that too, so that, I think that was one fold of like, man, God had what you intended for harm, God intended for good, in the reality of like the saving of many lives. And I even think of like what this would have meant for them in the thought that this interaction may have actually saved their lives. I think when you allow emotion and hatred and guilt and frustration and like to really engulf like your innermost being, though, that decision of selling your brother into slavery is a decision that they had to live with for the rest of their life. And I think when you live in guilt and in the fear of not being able to have an interaction of that forgiveness, or of that apology, or of that just rekindling of that relationship, there's like, they are living a life that I'm sure had truly been affected by their decisions, and harnessing and harboring that guilt probably through many years. And so the reality of what Joseph is doing here in forgiving his brothers, bringing them back into the fold, is, I mean, yes, Joseph has saved millions of people's lives through this famine, but man, he is saving the lives of his brothers in this, of they can finally live the rest of their lives and feeling like they have some closure to the decision that they've made, which kind of leads me to this reality of like, forgiveness saves lives, right? That was verse 20 here, is what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And that, I feel like, is a great image of what forgiveness actually does. So forgiveness is this, right? So forgiveness saves lives through the lens of this, and I kind of look at this as forgiveness provides freedom. Man, when we are hanging on to an inability to forgive, we are hanging on to something that has a hold of our heart. And then until we are able to release that and to experience and give forgiveness, we don't truly get to experience freedom. And what Joseph is offering them in this experience is freeing them. Like that's a powerful thing. So What I would love to do, because I think we can talk about the power of forgiveness a whole lot, and we see it in Scripture time and time again. Jesus talks about it a whole lot in interactions with his disciples, and the commission of how we are to forgive, and the importance of forgiving. But I think it's easier said than done. So what I want to do for the next few minutes, as we kind of lead this into this challenge, right? If we want to be able to send people, our students, away with something. What do you think are some common misconceptions or misunderstandings that we typically have about forgiveness? And if you want to ask a different way, because I just wanted to see what that led to, but the purpose of that question is I want to lead into the reality of what forgiveness actually is.
I think the misconceptions is that because people are so caught up in their emotions, or we've heard so many people say, I'll never forgive so-and-so, or I'll never forgive that person for what they did, that the misconception is that it's easier to not forgive people. The misconception is that it's, I don't need to talk to that person anymore. I don't need to have them in my life, so I'm not going to forgive them nor acknowledge them, and that's going to be easier for me. But like you had mentioned before, the burden of carrying that for the rest of your life, and the thought of not only are you not giving that other person freedom and knowing whether they deserve it or not, knowing like that you're not but you're also like you are not going to have freedom in not forgiving other people, because you have to carry that as well as they have to carry it, and so I think that is, for me, that's a huge misconception.
Yeah.
So
I think the reality is Joseph has an opportunity to make a choice with the hand that he was dealt, right? And he was given a hand in life that was extremely unfortunate, and he chose to take a route that would ultimately lead to forgiveness, which ultimately led to freedom, right? And so, but there was a choice in that, and I think, like you said, we have a decision to make, and the hard part of this is we tend to pull ourselves in the belief that we can't forgive something so terrible, and the longer that we hold that inability to forgive, it just weighs and weighs and weighs, and it'll affect everything. I mean, it'll affect decisions.
The way you see like relationships and life, and
yes,
and the decisions you make within that relationship. So
yeah, and so with that thought, I think a common misconception and misunderstanding I had of forgiveness was the thought that forgiveness meant that we forget, right? Because you always hear that phrase of forgive and forget. Well, I think forgiving and forgetting are two different things, right? Because I think forgiveness does not have to be forgetting the past or the things that have happened. I don't think it has to be creating an excuse for the things that have happened or condoning an action of the past. The literal definition of forgiveness is the releasing of feeling of anger, vendetta, bitterness, but it's the release of feeling. Right? And we started this conversation through what makes forgiveness so difficult. It's the emotion and the feeling that oftentimes we're actually taught in our culture to be led by. We make decisions that will make us feel happy, what makes us feel good, what makes us feel righteous, or like even in that, what makes us feel even. If somebody wrongs me, we're taught, well, I will feel better if I ghost that person, or just or get back at that person. But I think there's the challenge and the standard that God calls us into, right? Because we have a God who again exemplifies this ultimate understanding of forgiveness in that He sacrificed Himself for us, right? So forgiveness ultimately being to the cancellation of debt, right? And so when someone wrongs us, we kind of have this understanding that they are indebted to us. And we believe that because we're designed to believe that, right? So God has created us that when we sin, and when we have sinned, right? And Adam and Eve, we read about that a few weeks ago, is when sin entered the world, there was a consequence, and they were indebted, right? So they owed God something for sinning against him. And so that thus led to a sacrificial system where they would have to sacrifice live animals to provide as offering to the Lord, to make themselves one and to make themselves unified with God. Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice that the sins for the rest of humanity, right, would indebt us a debt that we would never be able to pay. And Jesus paid that for us. And so that's I just think it's so difficult because we're in a culture, in a society that if we owe someone something, they want their payment, right? I mean, it's a little maybe difficult to understand that as a student, but it's so easy to relate this to finances. And so when you borrow money, when you ask for a loan, when you you're expected to pay that back. You're in debt. When you take out a credit card and you spend $2,000 on a credit card, the credit card company expects you to pay that back. And until you pay that back, they will actually want to charge you more for that, right? It's okay, not only are you going to have to pay the $2,000 you owed, but you're going to have to pay, 15 to 20% interest on top of that. And so for a $2,000 purchase, you're actually may actually spend closer to $3,000 or $2,500 depending on the interest. So there's not only expectation of you're going to repay what's owed, there's actually an expectation on our culture and our society that you're going to have to pay back more than what's owed. And I think as that trickles into our personal lives, that is a barrier that I think is so difficult for us to really wrestle with, because when somebody wrongs us, we are trained to think not only should they repay me, but they should have to repay more than what they're indebted of me. And once we start getting into that game, it's difficult. But anyway, so I think that's one thing. But I think that the reality here, as we kind of lead into this, is understanding that the forgiveness is the releasing of feeling, and so that feeling of anger and frustration and bitterness you have towards somebody, forgiveness is not forgetting. The forgiveness is releasing, right? And when we are able to release of that feeling, when we are able to release of that emotion, we are providing ourselves freedom. And I love this quote. There's a couple quotes that I wanted to read too. There's a lot of great quotes on forgiveness, but these two have always kind of hit me the hardest. And so the first quote, and I get your reaction on them, and then we'll bring this to a close. But the first quote is this: "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you." What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that speaks volumes. I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier and how the burden of not forgiving people, you think, I'm going to put the blame on that person. I'm not going to do it because it's good. I'm hurting that person. I'm getting that revenge back on that person because of what they did to me. But at the end of the day, all those emotions and all those feelings, all those things that you have to carry, that you have to hold within your heart, is going to wear. And kind of like that quote says, at the end of the day, you were imprisoning yourself with all those emotions and all those feelings, which is exhausting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and so here's a second quote, and I only say this quote because do you remember the point that we ended with last week, and having these tough conversations?
I don't remember the point.
Point number 4.
Oh, go ahead, you share.
It was preparation.
Yep, preparation and prayer. It was.
Number 2 was. Oh goodness.
I know.
Number 3 was humility. Number 2 was. Listening.
Yes.
And then number 4, so listening, humility, and then 4 was love.
Yes.
Love, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Testing me in the middle of the video.
I know. I'm sorry. Maybe we'll scrap it. We'll edit that out. Maybe not though. All right. Here's a quote. It says, "There is no love without forgiveness, and there is no forgiveness without love." What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that speaks volumes. I think that, the way that quote says, at the end of the day, all those emotions and all those feelings, all those things that you have towards somebody, the fact that they go hand in hand, I think is the key within that. Especially as Christians, we're called to love our neighbors and love others. It's the most important thing that God has called us to do, and through that love and through living for Christ should naturally allow us to forgive others, especially our family. But we're also human and we are sinners, and so I know that it's not an easy task even as Christians. But like we always said, God didn't put us here to be uncomfortable, or did not put us here to be comfortable. We are going to be uncomfortable, and forgiving people is uncomfortable, especially when we are so full of emotions about it. So the biggest challenge for this week with this topic of forgiveness is, especially when you're getting ready to reflect, what are you holding on to? What are those feelings that are dragging you down, that you are just latched onto, that you're imprisoning yourself with? And so as we get ready to pray, I want you guys to just kind of think about that and think about the freedom that can come of letting go of all of those emotions and letting go of those feelings and those decisions and forgiving those people in your lives. It's forgiving your family in order to create freedom for them, but also for yourself. So we're going to pray.
Yeah, I'll pray.
Okay.
You want to pray?
No, you can pray. You can pray.
Father God, we are just so thankful for you. You're an amazing God who continues to love us unconditionally in the midst of a time where we need it. We need your love. We need your outpouring of love. We need your love to spread within our communities, within our city, within our nation. Lord, we need you. And Lord, I just pray that we can be a church that as we experience your love and as we are marked by your love and experience the change of your love, that we can be a church that moves on that it drives us and propels us to action, to lead us to forgive others, to lead us to love others well, to lead us to having these tough conversations in an effective manner, to lead us to listen well, lead us to slow to anger, slow to speak, but give us platforms and opportunities and a voice where we get to exemplify the love of you, because you, in your love, give our world and our nation a hope that we desperately need. And so just let us be a church, a ministry of hope, where we can just continue to express that into every relationship that we have. We just, again, thank you for these students. We thank you for the families that they are a part of. We continue to pray a blessing over those families, that they can continue to being led closer and closer, more intimate as a family with you, that they can continue to be changed and marked by your love in that family as well. So again, we're just so thankful for you and all you do for us. We're just thankful for an opportunity to speak about families that ultimately just speak into how we interact with every relationship that we have. So again, we're thankful for you and we praise you, and it's your son's name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Love you guys.
Bye.
See you soon.
Love you.